We know that Reagan's administration comes in after a long period of shifting in American politics. And so, what's seen as this sort of breakthrough moment of conservative political domination during Reagan's administration is really something that's been in the works for a while. One of the things that really helps Reagan in the election of 1980 is that Carter is just really not electable at this point. Between his sort of matter of fact response to people suffering in the energy crisis and his inability to get Iran to release the hostages during that crisis, Americans just don't see him as a viable leader anymore. And this is really huge because we can remember how much people saw him as down to earth and personable when he was first elected. But the election of 1980 shows precisely how far Jimmy Carter has fallen at this point. Now, we know that maps can be incredibly deceptive when it comes to elections. People vote, not land. But even when you look at the popular vote, Carter only pulled in 41% and lost several key densely populated states. And it's not just the executive branch where the Democratic Party experienced losses. The election of 1980 also spelled out the end of the long-standing Democratic dominance of Congress, although some of this might have to do with political realignment. In any case, Reagan's support here is a clear landslide. Part of his success can be characterized by the support of his base. In addition to his popularity as a former movie star, Reagan got the support of evangelical Christians, who in the early 80s consolidated their political support in the form of an organization called the Moral Majority. Generally speaking, they supported the Republican Party in principles like reduced taxes and a free market economy based in deregulation and laissez-faire practices. But they also supported government policies that aligned with their religious principles: opposition to radical feminism, LGBTQ policies, pro-choice flexibility, and affirmative action. They also heavily funded organizations that funded programs associated with the war on drugs and community-based political activism like Save Our Children, and really anything else to do with the purity of children. Given the religious and conservative foundations of the organization, none of these things are particularly surprising. More liberal leaning organizations at the time did essentially the same thing, but in reverse. What's more surprising is that they'd choose to support Reagan as a candidate, the first president to be elected as a divorced man, and who'd signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act into law as governor of California. Although, as a sidebar, his decision to sign that particular bill was more political calculation than out of actual support for the bill. What Reagan might have had going against him, he more than made up for in his ability to effectively communicate conservative talking points. He gave speeches reiterating the freedoms of the United States in contrast to those of places like the USSR. He criticized the federal government as a vehicle for trampling on those freedoms, and made boogeymen out of any group that might undermine white middle class advancement, like imaginary welfare queens. And within this space, and even outside of this space really, he was wildly effective. We don't call him the great communicator for nothing. Reagan had a way of talking that was calming and met people on their level. And in the middle of an economic crisis and watching an entire year of the US government flailing around trying to get hostages back every day from across the world, that's what people wanted. And it did matter that some people didn't like his politics, for some more than others. But one of the reasons why Reagan was so effective was that when he opened his mouth, people stopped to listen to him, even if they weren't necessarily going to like what he was going to say. One of the things that Reagan faces in office that comes directly into conflict with his support base is the AIDS crisis. AIDS as a virus is first identified during Reagan's first term in 1981, and at this point there's really just not a lot of great information about exactly what's going on. Think about the early period of the COVID outbreak in 2020. At first, there's the general knowledge that the virus exists, and then there's sort of general information about how it might be spreading, but nobody is really sure yet because there's just not a lot of research. And really, honestly, just the crappy part about this whole thing is that we have to wait for more people to become infected so that there's more information and data to study in order to really understand what's happening and how it spreads. And so early on, the Reagan administration put some money into this, but not a lot because they just don't really understand the size of the impact of the problem. Part of the problem is that they also just personally aren't taking it very seriously. We've got transcripts of conversations from the Oval Office phone where they're joking around about if each other have caught it or not. And it's really just totally unprofessional and reflects very poorly on the office of the president. Meanwhile, there was all kinds of misinformation being spread about the virus. For example, we know now that AIDS isn't specifically tied to same sex communities or behavior. But at the time, since that's where it was first detected in clusters, that's what people associated it with. And so they started calling it the gay plague, which is really bad because one, it stigmatizes the LGBTQ plus community for no reason. And two, it does a lot of damage in terms of preventing the spread of the disease in other ways that it spreads, like through shared needles and blood and such. The stigma of it spreading solely through the gay community also meant that a lot of LGBTQ plus friendly places like bars and clubs where people could go to get information and organize to actually combat the disease started discriminating against these groups and preventing progress. And the discrimination didn't stop there. The letter on the left of the screen was sent by the American Family Association, a conservative nonprofit, calling for a, quote, national petition to quarantine all homosexual establishments, and calling members of the gay community, quote, disease-carrying deviants and sex-crazed degenerates. A lot of times there's a misconception that the hardline anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment from his base caused Reagan to not act fast enough in the AIDS crisis or not to speak up enough in the AIDS crisis. And while people might debate endlessly on whether he might have talked more openly about it in his speeches, there's pretty clear evidence that when presented with new information on the virus, his administration did make their best effort to act on it. But as we've experienced with the COVID pandemic, the federal government's role in a public health crisis can be extremely complicated, and how that's handled then in the states can become even more complicated. Add to this the fact that the LGBTQ plus community was already an extremely stigmatized group. And so when, in some stages, state governments thought that the best course of action was to limit access to or close down businesses where they thought the virus might be more likely to spread, places like gay bars, for example, the LGBTQ community saw that, understandably, as an act of oppression rather than an act of public safety. The information we have, though, does indicate that the Reagan administration, at least on the federal level, attempted to find medical research and educational tools to help curb the spread of the virus. Like all medical and educational resources, though, these were and are disproportionately distributed by race. If you look at the bottom chart, African Americans and Latinx individuals account for 69% of AIDS cases as of 2018, while only accounting for 31% of the general population. Reagan's rise to prominence as a conservative powerhouse in the 80s came after a long political overhaul in the 2 decades before his administration, but his ability to effectively command control over the conservative agenda guaranteed that his time in office would be remembered as revolutionary, and he set the path forward in shaping Republican policies in terms of women's reproductive rights, economic policy, and immigration reform for the foreseeable future.